Hello everybody, and I'm just putting a small video on here really directed at beginners, but suitable for anyone if you're not sure about types of paint to buy, palettes, mixing, those issues. And mixing watercolors can be a real big issue when you're a complete beginner. So I thought I'd just do a quick little video just to give you some information. So this is what I would term my working palette. So this is one that I use pretty much daily. And basically it's just, this one's tin, but you can get them in plastic, and it literally is just empty. When I bought it, this was completely empty. It was also clean. But basically this is what it is. And I filled up these little wells, for want of a better description, and I've used tube paints. Now, as you can see, this is rock solid. And all I do is I fill up the slot when it's empty or nearly empty, like this. I do know that that is ultramarine, and I've just filled it with ultramarine blue. So all I do now is just leave it and then let it set. And then when I come to use it, all I've got to do is awaken my paint. So by that, all I'm going to do is put a couple of drops of water on my paint, leave it for a second, and then literally, I'm just finding a bit of scrap paper. So literally all I will do then is, using my brush, let's see if I can find a good bit of scrap paper here. This will do. So here's my bit of paper, here's my brush. I will damp my brush down, but not a lot of water in this case. And then I can just go in, my paint's open, and I can pick up as much as I like. And I can add this to more water to vary the consistency of the paint. And this for me is the most economical way of painting. Now, most of these are tubed paints, but there are one or two, especially for instance in the greens, that I have some tubed paint and then I have some pre-mixed. So for some of these, the dark greens for instance, then what I've actually done is I've mixed two colours together and then put them in here so that I've got a green that I will use regularly. But for me, this is the most economic, cost-effective, and the easiest way of actually working with a palette. So as I say, you can buy these from most art stores. This one's quite old, it's metal. You can still get the metal ones, I have seen them. They're not cheap. Probably nowadays you're better off just having a look and going with the plastic one. How many wells you have varies from one palette to another. It's unimportant really. I like a number of wells, as I say. Some of them are tubed paint, some of them are colours that I've mixed. Now, one of the other options you've got, and I do use these, this is one that's been bought as a set. I think this is a Winsor & Newton one. And it's got lots of handy little bits where I can mix paint and things. And I tend to use these out and about more than anything else. And this is what we call a half pan. You can buy them as full pans, which basically means each of these little slots has is double that size. Now, when I had this, you can see them here, they were all full of these little perfect half pans. However, when they go empty, I don't replace the little half pans. I simply use tubed paint to put into it and fill it up, the same as the other palette. Let it dry, and then again, exactly as with the other palette, I can open them up, and as soon as I open them up by touching them with a little bit of water, they're ready to go. So here we go. Here's my bit of paper. So here's my orange that's now reopened. And again, I take this with me when I go out because it's just easier to carry. But you can replace them by going out and buying either half pans or full pans. The only difference is these are half pans. A full pan would be the double the size. So each one of these basically would be your colour. And if you have one of these and it's empty and you also have tubes, you can save yourself some money just by filling it up. Again, there's numerous ones of these, numerous manufacturers. As I said, this is also quite old, I will be honest, but it is a Winsor & Newton, and they still do this virtually exactly the same palette, because some of the people in my art class have indeed bought them. And then the other thing we have are these little mixing palettes. Now, some people love them, some people hate them. Quite often when you're starting out and you've got your first lot of paints, things like this will be what you begin with. And it seems self-explanatory, but all is not as it seems. So one of the biggest issues we've got is mixing. So let's have a look at the basics. So if I'm working with this palette and I have tubed paints, what tends to happen is that people, let's just go with this one, people will put their paint inside the palette like that, and then they'll add water. And the reality is that you end up adding more and more and more water to try and get the right colour, because your pigment in there. Now, I'll remind you that I've said in the past that we call it watercolour, but it actually was originally coloured water. And I think the reasoning behind that is that if you call it coloured water, you're starting with the water rather than the paint. And it's a far more sensible way of doing it, and it's also far more cost effective, and you've got more control. So if someone's working with this type of palette and you're actually using tubed paint, I would recommend, rather than putting your paint into a well, you put it at the side of the well. And if I'm working with a palette like this, I tend to try and keep a well and then keep a spare one. Depends on your painting, obviously, and what you're doing. And then another thing that's brilliant, very cheap, very easy, is one of these little pipettes. This one, as you can see, is slightly disgusting. It's very old. This allows you to take control of how much water you're putting in each well. Now, this can be important, especially if you're doing wet washes, because if I mix paint up and I have one well that is full to the brim, and then I have other wells that have a lot less water in, I'm not going to get the same consistency. So if I start my wet on wet wash and I use a thick paint and then I start adding thinner paints to it, all that will happen is that the thinner paint will run everywhere and you'll get cauliflowers and all sorts of issues starting to arise. So let's have a little look. When we talk about consistency of paint, then what we're really talking about is how much water and how much pigment we've got in it. Now, if I put a little tiny bit off the top here into this first well, it looks surprisingly dark. When I put that on a piece of paper, you can barely see it. If I put that on a piece of paper that I've already wet, that will disperse even further. So now there's virtually no colour there. By putting my paint up here, I'm in control of how much pigment, that's your paint, I actually add to the water. And when I get it to the desired level that I want it at for my picture, then I know that I've mixed enough pigment with it and I don't have to keep adding more and more paint to get the right colour. If I do it in reverse, so I've got all this water in here, if I then start trying to add pigment to that, or I put my pigment in first as we did here, I can have to, so if we use that one that we mixed with the pigment inside, so if I use that one, look how dark it is. To get that to that consistency, I have to keep adding water. So this, for me, is the best way of working. It also means that when I'm finished working, if I haven't used all the paint around the edges, then I can save that. And one of the best ways of saving it, you just suck out the water, or you can leave it open and it will eventually just dry. It will just dehydrate down and just leave the paint. But I can suck out all the water. Leave my neat pigment on the side. And then, as long as I use something to raise the center, so this or an egg cup is what I usually use, a small egg cup turned upside down, or a small pot in the middle, and then wrap it with cling film, I can actually preserve that paint until the next time I'm ready to paint something. So I'm not throwing it all away. So that makes it more economical and more worthwhile. On a balance, I would say to you, the best thing, as far as I'm concerned, that's just my opinion, is tubed paints. Everything else has its place and its uses, but tubed paint will go on and last for a very long time. In the long run, it will save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of aggravation. So let's go back to our mixing. So I'm going to put a little bit of water in there, some water in there, and some water in this one. I've roughly got the same amount of water in each well. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to pick up my paint here again, and I'm going to mix it in. I'm going to put quite a lot of pigment in this time. I'm going to just give it a good mix. Now, the other thing is when you've mixed your paint and you leave it in the well for a short space of time, what happens is the pigment weighs more than the water. So the pigment will sink to the bottom of the water. And if you don't stir it when you come to pick it up, what you're doing is picking up more of the surface water. It will still have pigment in it, but it won't give you a true impression of what the colour is. So let's just mix all that in there. Nicely mixed. And then I'm going to take that and we're going to put it on the paper here. So that's how dark it is. And this is just a little bit thinner than single cream. And that's how I probably explain it. So this is my single cream consistency. It's very rich, it's very vibrant. If I was doing this on wet, that would still be a strong, vibrant colour. So in the next consistency down we have, I'm going to take a brush full of that and put it into the next well. So this well will be half as strong as the one at the beginning. And this would be more like the consistency of milk. And if I do the same again and move it into here, this will have very little colour in it compared to what's gone beforehand. And this would be the consistency of ink. So the consistencies that we have is more water than pigment, that's ink-like. And then we have a little bit more pigment, more even with the water, and that would be milk-like. And then the thickest one, which has a lot of pigment compared to water, is what I would describe as single cream. When we do washes, then we generally work with the middle here. But if you want a pale wash, a very pale background, then you will work with a much thinner amount of pigment. So realistically, plan what you want your background to look like. If you want it very pale and pastel, it's less pigment to water. But if it's for washes, then generally you want to start with the thinnest wash. And then if you add other colours to it, they want to be slightly thicker. It's all about the water control. Remember, it's coloured water. Keep that in mind and you'll do much better with your mixing. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you understand. If you've got any questions, then please feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. In terms of paint, people often ask questions about what type of paint. Well, I would say go with the best that you can afford. I mostly use Winsor & Newton, but I say mostly, I do use Derwent. I also use the SAA's own brand, that's the Society for All Artists here in the UK. I also use brands from Ken Bromley, and in America there are a number of outlets that I'm not really familiar with, so I would say have a play, have a look, see what you can buy a tube, buy a small amount and see how you get on with it. What I would advise is buy the best quality you can to start with. If you get 20 paints for £1 or £2 or $2, it really isn't going to have a very good pigment content. Pigment is the colour itself. That just means that there's probably more filler in it than there is actual pigment. If it looks yellow, you're still going to get yellow. The problem usually happens when it comes to mixing two colours together. So when you've got paints that have more pigment, so they're pigment rich, you're going to get truer colours when you mix colours together. If all you can afford is cheap paints, then buy cheap paints, because it's more important that you actually paint than not paint. I hope this is helpful and good luck. Any questions, let me know and I'll do my best. Thank you. Bye.